Hello and welcome to today's video, which really is going to focus on the top grades with comparing your power and conflict poems. In this video I'm going to dive into the mark scheme at grades 8 and 9 and grade 7, and then we're going to pop down to grade 6 because I'm going to teach you that in grades 4, 5 and 6 it really doesn't matter which poems you compare to which. And it's only once you get into grade 7 that the comparisons matter. And the comparisons are going to work like this. I'll give you the main poem on the left and then some other poems it compares to, and I'll explain why these comparisons work. Now the great news is if you can understand these comparisons, you're on for a grade 7. It's as simple as that. You will have to write well. You'll have to be able to use the Foss way in order to do that, in order to write about form and structure, and up here I'll put a link to the Foss way. The other thing I'll try to do, because we've got 15 poems, is timestamp them in the description underneath so that you can go for individual poems. Right, let's start with Remains. Now, in each of these you'll notice I have the word purpose, and it's when you start thinking of the poet's purpose that you're going to get the grade 7. Rather than just say linking all of these because they're war poems. So you'll notice I'm going to offer you Checking Out My History, which is not a war poem. So let's see what Mr. Salles is on about. We've got 4 purposes here. Let's start with this one. To expose the after effects of war on individuals who participated in it. Well, that links us exactly to Kamikaze and the after effects on the pilot. We could also add in the after effects on his family. So there's an interesting comparison. And the poet's purpose is to criticize society here and also to criticize our society here. So now I've got this interesting purpose which isn't just about war. Another purpose to Remains is to make a political point that soldiers are not looked after. That's why he's having a mental breakdown. And to make us sympathise with the soldiers. Well, if that's my purpose, I can choose Exposure, which focuses on the hardships of war, which are shown as dehumanising to make us sympathise with the soldiers. Or I might decide that Remains is a political poem that makes a wider political point that one culture, in this case ours, can't fairly impose itself on another culture, which is represented by the slaughter of this looter in a country like Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan. Well, if I want to show that it's about cultural imposition and cultural power, then actually I'm going to compare it to Checking Out My History, which shows that British imperial power was corrupt, as was French imperial power, and that this power still continues into the modern day through the portrayal of the British history, a Eurocentric history that excludes Afro-Caribbean history. Well, once I do that, possibly my most eye-catching comparison with Remains is going to be Checking Out My History. All of these will get me grade 7 or above if I do it properly. Now, let me show you why this is so important. So we're at the very top of the mark scheme here, and the examiners want us to be exploratory, and exploring the writer's ideas, as I've just done, is going to get us in the top band. It also wants us to take a conceptualized approach to the full task. In other words, we have to write about concepts. Well, whose? Well, obviously, the poet's concepts. So, linking the poems by topic, they're both war poems, doesn't tell us anything about a concept. But linking it to the poet's purpose, that's a concept. Okay, Miss or Mr. Examiner, please consider me in the top mark range. Right, now we come down to this. We have to have a convincing exploration of one or more ideas. Well, whose ideas? The poet's. Therefore, we have the poet's purpose. So you can see the comparisons you're going to get in this video are forcing the examiner to want to put you into the top band. Well, loads of you will be saying, come on, Mr. Salles, I'm not going to get a grade 8 or a 9 straight off. Well, perhaps, so let's look down at grade 7. At grade 7, you only possibly need alternative interpretations. Well, that's quite interesting. You also don't need the conceptualized response that we had before. You just have to be thoughtful and detailed and developed. So actually, starting with the poet's purpose is better than a grade 7. So it's going to be really hard for the examiner not to give you at least a grade 7 if your comparisons write about the poet's purpose all the time. Now, if we come down to grade 6, there's no argument that you've got to put forward at all, and you've just got to have a clear understanding of some ideas. Well, that means that if you've got the poet's purpose in, that's ideas, you've got a grade 6 nailed, even if everything else in your essay is not so good. Yep, so when we come back up to grade 7, deeper meanings, that again is the poet's purposes, poet's ideas, and you're going to get this grade nailed. Okay, here are the purposes of Kamikaze. To show that a culture can abandon life and glorify death. You know, that's the whole idea of this kamikaze pilot sacrificing his life in some glorious way. To show the after effects of war on those who participate in it. You can see what happens to this pilot and his wife wondering which had been the better way to die. To portray cultural celebration of patriotism and the warrior, sacrifice and the emperor, and here to perhaps criticize it. To show that time can heal and generations form new perspectives. Many of you might not notice, but the person speaking the poet at the end, the pilot's daughter, does accept him back in because he becomes the grandfather to her children. So anyway, she accepts him when she's grown up, not when she's a little kid. To show that war creates a sense of nihilism. Nihilism is a kind of a sense of pointlessness. And he's obviously thought it's pointless to kill himself, but then his later life must also have felt very pointless. And to explore the importance of memory. This is a poem told from the point of view of the daughter, but also the wife, who's the mother of the daughter. Quite complex. You'll have to go and watch my video on Kamikaze if that doesn't make sense. Okay, so I love this one if this one comes up because it's got so many things I can write about. Right, let's have a look at the purpose of Remains. Well, that's to expose the after effects of war on the individuals, so I can make a clear link. It also links to Exposure, which was about the importance of memory. You remember the soldiers dreaming of being back at home, and that's possibly what's keeping them going. And it also has this sense of nihilism and pointlessness. They're just waiting all the time, but nothing happens. So I've got 2 points of comparison there, which would suggest that's a good one to compare with Kamikaze. I could also compare it to Charge of the Light Brigade, which is all about patriotic propaganda, which is the same sort of propaganda that said that becoming a kamikaze pilot was a great way to die. It promotes the cult of the warrior and death as a noble sacrifice. So they're very closely aligned in theme, so this would be an excellent comparison. Here's a more unusual one perhaps, Poppies, which explores the power of the patriarchy, well unlike that one, and what this does to the mother's role. Well, this poem is all about mothers. It's the mother who tells the daughter about her husband, and it's the daughter who's telling her children about their grandfather. So it's actually a poem entirely about female perspectives, just as Poppies is all about female perspectives. And look, there's 2 more. It explores the consequences of a warrior culture and the death cult on women. So here it's the mother who's left behind, the opposite of the kind of emotion in Kamikaze where the women would have glorified in his death. Here the mother is not glorifying in the potential death of her son at all. And both of them explore the importance of memory. So suddenly I've got Poppies as a really great comparison. But also I could have Bayonet Charge. Bayonet Charge asked us to question the typical justification of war, just like the Kamikaze pilot did, and it questions patriotism and honour, just like Kamikaze does. Both of them portray war as alien and dehumanising in order to protest against it. So we can see Kamikaze as an anti-war poem. Then, bizarrely, but because we're looking at the poet's purposes, we can compare it to a poem that is not about war. So here, London is trying to show that the problems within society are caused by those in power, the church, the king and parliament, and men in the patriarchy are damaging lives. Well, the people in power in the Kamikaze is the emperor. It's the emperor who commanded pilots to kill themselves. There's that metaphor about the tuner being the Dark Prince, which I think is, if you like, a reference to the monarchy, a reference to the emperor, and the emperor therefore being dark because he requires sacrifice. And then to show the damaging effects on society when it exploits its children. There are loads of ways that children are exploited in London, and obviously the children are exploited in Kamikaze when they're told and taught not to laugh in front of their father, not to talk to him, no longer to love him. It's a really corrupt society that attacks its children. But at the end, the daughter brings her father back into the fold and makes him the grandfather of her own children, and then she tells the story to her own children of what happened to her grandfather during the war, to their grandfather during the war, to her father. In this video, it's up to you to choose the comparison that works best for you, because you'll all have studied the poems in a different way. My temptation is always to go with the ones that seem most original, but also to go into the exam knowing that I don't just have to limit my comparisons to two. You can do, though. So out of all the ones that I've presented, I actually find London the most imaginative one, and it's the one that the examiners are going to find most interesting because it's not about war. On the other hand, the question might be just about war, in which case I'd have to pick one of my other war poems to compare it to. Okay, now let's look at London. So one purpose is to show that cities are inherently corrupt. So we've got here Blake, a romantic poet who believes in this pastoral ideal of people living in harmony with nature in the countryside. And so he's writing about London to show how this has destroyed that element of communal living and utopian living in the countryside. He wants to show that private ownership excludes the ordinary man, but makes everybody miserable. It also shows that the problems within society are caused by those in power, represented by the church, the king, and an undemocratic parliament, because not everyone gets the vote. And it's also about men in the patriarchy who are damaging lives. It's also about the damaging effect of male sexual desire, which we can see in the fact that they exploit young prostitutes and then bring sexually transmitted diseases home, which is the marriage hearse. It kills off the marriage. And it also shows the damaging effect on society when it exploits its children, which we see through the chimney sweep, but also through the baby's cry at the end, symbolising how all children are exploited, either born into prostitution or those born in respectable marriages, but victims of their mother's venereal diseases passed on by the fathers. So lots of purposes here. A great poem that you'd love to come up, especially as the ones written before 1918 always have a lot of form and structure about them. I'll deal with that in a separate video, but it really lends itself to getting the top grades. Well, amazingly, my favourite one to compare this to is actually Emigree. Emigree also explores the difficulties faced by people, here it's migrants, living in a foreign sort of environment, like moving from the countryside into the city. She also shows how cities are corrupt and dangerous. So the city she's left is hostile, but also is the city that she's come to. She's not accepted. she has a lone voice where she's trying to achieve political change. It's a bit of a protest poem. And London is also a protest poem. Blake wrote it in response to the French Revolution, and he's asking his readers, why haven't we also had a revolution to get rid of our corrupt king and corrupt church? Quite an interesting idea. So, both after political change, and also showing how both can try to resist the power of the tyrant, tyrannical rulers. So this is, if you like, a resistance poem as well. So loads of poet's purposes that we can easily compare there. Let's now have a look at Kamikaze. So Kamikaze wants to portray a cultural celebration of patriotism and sacrifice for the nobility in the form of the emperor. So I could use Kamikaze as a counter-argument. Kamikaze is like the opposite of the argument that Blake is putting forward to in London. It's also showing that time can heal and generations form new perspectives, which is the opposite of that final stanza of London when it looks that time doesn't heal, it just makes things worse, unless we have a revolution to change what's going on. We could also compare it to My Last Duchess, which shows the corrupt power of patriarchal society, so the Duke is male, and it also shows the corruption of the nobility, because it's a Duke after all, and he's used by Browning to represent all those with inherited power and inherited wealth, just like the Church, Parliament, and of course the monarchy. We now have 3 comparisons with Checking Out My History. So this is my next favourite one after the Emigree, which you remember had 4 comparisons. So in Checking Out My History, we're given the corrupt power of British and French imperialism, the corrupt power of the rulers, just as in London. It's also written to show that political power can be resisted by the oppressed. In this case, it's the narrator of the poem, or the main protagonist, and it's the same in London, where it's the protagonist who wanders freely in comparison to everybody else who doesn't. And it's also to celebrate poetry as a form of protest and a way to acquire political power or gain social change. They're both about that. And there are also strong links in terms of the structure. Both are partly written in a kind of nursery rhyme, childlike structure. So this is my second favourite way to compare it. Now let's go back to the mark scheme, because we have to be tactical. The mark scheme wants me to write about the form and structure of the poems, so any comparison that makes that easy is going to be the comparison that I favour in the exam. So even though Emigree was my personal favourite and my go-to instinct in the exam, okay, I'm going to do that one, the mark scheme says it's a no-brainer. I've got to change to Checking Out My History, because it's going to be much easier to write about form and structure in that one. And that's why I'm going to make a separate form and structure video for you. And also why I'm going to recommend that you make your main revision around the poems written before 1918, because they all have a clearly defined form and structure. Well, I say that, Prelude doesn't, but the fact that it doesn't is also something you can write about, because it's a deliberate choice by Wordsworth. Okay, this is a case in point. We're going to look at exposure. This is written before 1918, and look at the number of purposes. So I'm just praying that this one comes up, because I know I'm going to be able to smash the grade 7 or above. So one purpose is to explore patriotism and suggest that it is an illusion. The war is pointless, and there's no point dying for your country. The other is to focus on the hardships of war, which are dehumanizing, as we see in the description of the soldiers, and he wants us to feel sympathy for them. He's writing for the British public and trying to show them that they're not prepared for the reality of war. They still think it's noble and honourable, but actually soldiers are dying needlessly, not just in battle, but freezing to death, because of the conditions and their lack of proper clothing and equipment. It's also to explore the importance of memory, as we see when they start dreaming of home. It's to celebrate the power of metaphor. This nature attacking them is all told through metaphors, where nature is presented as an army. And that's, if you like, a structural technique that I'm going to be able to compare. It's also really interested in the sounds of words in poetry. You'll have to go and watch my video on exposure to see what I mean there. But the lines are rich in sound, and it's important to be read out loud. He wants to show that war creates a sense of nihilism, sense that life is pointless and without meaning. And he also portrays war as a crime against nature. It's totally unnatural, which is why nature starts to rebel against them and attack them, as though they're invading nature through their man-made war. Okay, what can I compare it to? Well, I'm going to go first to Kamikaze, which shows that a culture can abandon life and glorify death. And that's what Wilfred Owen is complaining about in Exposure. To show the after effects of war on those who participate in it. This is not after the war, but during the war, but it's definitely on the same theme. To show that war creates nihilism, and also to explore the importance of memory. Okay, I've got 4 comparisons there. That's going to be a top poem to compare to Exposure. I could choose Remains, which exposes the after effects of war on the individuals who participate in it, and also makes a political point that soldiers are not looked after, and tries to make us sympathise with the soldiers. Cool. 2 comparisons, so not as good as Kamikaze, but I might still be able to write really well about that. Now we have 4 comparisons from Charge of the Light Brigade. Charge of the Light Brigade is written to support patriotic propaganda, so this is a contrast to Exposure. It has the opposite purpose. It wants to promote the cult of the warrior and death as a noble sacrifice. So if you like, Exposure is a literary conversation where Wilfred Owen is writing a reply to this kind of patriotism, a reply to this poem. But in the Charge of the Light Brigade, there are also subtle hints that the war is wrong. This is a really sophisticated point. You need to watch my video on Charge of the Light Brigade to go through that. I'm not going to go through it here. Interestingly, Charge of the Light Brigade is written at a time when people routinely memorised poems, and so he's absolutely obsessed with the sound of his poem and writes it in order to be read aloud. And that's similar to Wilfred Owen, who is also really fascinated by the sounds he can create. So that's going to be a structure point, and therefore Charge of the Light Brigade is going to be a top comparison to use. And remember, tactically, I want to revise the ones that are written before 1918. So even though I preferred my first comparison to Kamikaze, I'm actually going to find that being able to write about structure and form is going to be easier writing about Charge of the Light Brigade. So this is going to be my go-to comparison. Finally, I've got 3 comparisons I can make to War Photographer. War Photographer explores the damaging effect of war on those who report on it and therefore are in it. Wilfred Owen is also writing as a reporter. He's trying to educate the people at home on the realities of war. Both of them are trying to accuse their readership of indifference to the foreign suffering. That's where the but nothing happens comes. Nobody's doing anything about this terrible suffering. And they both question the role of the media in perpetuating or preventing war. In Exposure, that's a bit more indirect, which is why Wilfred Owen is having to write the poem to correct the role of the media, which seems to be saying that the war is a patriotic duty. While I'm happy with those comparisons, Charge of the Light Brigade is still my winner. So let's go to Charge of the Light Brigade. We already know that Exposure is going to be the top comparison possibly, but let's have a look at the other possible comparisons. So, purpose that we've got for this poem: to support patriotic propaganda, to promote the cult of the warrior and the idea of death as a noble sacrifice. But, as I hinted at earlier, also to hint at the war being wrong. So if you go and watch my Charge of the Light Brigade video, you'll see how subtle this is, and it's also connected to the idea of the structure of the poem, so it's going to be a really useful revision point. It's made to be memorable, as we discussed, and it explores the use of sound in the poetry. Well, it links well to Kamikaze, which also has the same theme, that patriotic idea that life is worth sacrificing. It also glorifies death. It portrays a culture that puts patriotism at its heart, celebrates the warrior and the sacrifice in order for a ruler, for the king in this case, in Charge of the Light Brigade and the Emperor in Japan. However, Kamikaze also shows that war creates a sense of nihilism. It's a protest. The nihilism in the Light Brigade is actually seen as noble. There's but to do and die. So although life is pointless in the sense that you're just going to die, it's not pointless because that death has a patriotic point. Although you can flip that, of course, and say actually they died for nothing. It was a pointless charge. It didn't succeed in changing the war in any way. They just died for no gain. So this is where we get the nihilism idea. And they both explore the importance of memory. So Kamikaze is also obviously about the memory of the father and family memory, whereas here we're talking about a national collective memory. And what we've got is Tennyson as a poet laureate, the representative of Queen Victoria, appointed to this role as poet laureate, and his job is to write poetry that's going to change the national mood and change the national memory. And of course it does. We're still reading it now. So I'm totally happy with these comparisons. Very detailed. I know I'm going to smash the grade 7. We can look at Remains, which is to expose the after effects of war on individuals who participated in it. And that's a contrast here because the after effect is death. And also to make a political point that soldiers are not looked after and make us sympathise with the soldiers. So again, this is written with the opposite intention. So it's a contrasting poem to Charge of the Light Brigade. Obviously, I've got exposure, which I've just been through. And you know why that is my favourite, especially as it's written before 1918. And then finally, I can compare it to War Photographer, which is all about the damaging effect of war on those who report on it. And this is quite a sophisticated point because Tennyson got his source material from the Times newspaper. And therefore he is, if you like, reporting second-hand on the war. And I think that damages him as a poet. So he's having to write about the war in a way that ultimately he doesn't agree with. This is a really sophisticated point. You'll only understand it probably if you watch my video on Charge of the Light Brigade. And this invites us to question the role of the media in perpetuating the idea of war. So although this only has 2 points, it is a really sophisticated comparison. So I'd be quite tempted to deviate from my pre-1918 plan, and I could quite happily write about that one. Okay, now Ozymandias I'm really excited about because it is a pre-1918 poem, and I'm only giving you pre-1918 poems to compare it with, and the obvious favourite is going to be My Last Duchess. So Ozymandias is written to show how the power of art transcends history, and that's all about the sculpture and the sculptor, and they represent the power of the artist. And similarly, Shelley believes he himself is an artist, and his poem Ozymandias is going to live on in the same way that the sculptor's art did. He's writing a contrast of political power, which he says is ephemeral, and the power of art, which is eternal. He's also writing to promote democracy. This is a criticism of tyrants and dictators, and in his own lifetime he has in mind particularly a ruler like Napoleon, who's only just been defeated a few years before. He's also writing it to promote his own poetic skill. He was in fact entered into a competition That's the reason it was written. He had a competition only with his friend, but there you go. They both got theirs published, and his was the better poem. It survived. And you can see that he's trying to promote his own skill because he wants his own poet to survive as a work of art, unlike the political power of dictators. And then that also explores the awkward compromise between art and those in power, because the sculptor has had to ingratiate himself with Ozymandias in order to make the sculpture of him, but then has been quite subtle in making that sculpture a really true portrait of this corrupt ruler, Ramesses II or Ozymandias, and through that exposes the ruler's cruelty. And it's done through the power of his art. And then symbolically, of course, that portrait is what survives. That shattered visage still conveys the power of the artist. Okay, well, My Last Duchess is in a way all about art, and it's all about the power of the poet. So Browning is writing this as a new kind of poetry. He's writing it as a theatrical monologue, not something that had been particularly popular. So he's inventing or promoting a kind of new form of poetry, celebrating his own art and artistry as a poet. And that promotes his own poetic skill. He also wants to expose the corruption of the nobility, represented by the Duke, and it's also about the compromise between artists. Artists are named in this poem, they're invented artists, but Browning's point is rich men get great art created, but there's a great compromise in the artists themselves having to produce something that is, if you like, tarnished or corrupt. And we see that in the portrait of My Last Duchess, which is painted just before she's executed. And he needs the portrait, the Duke needs the portrait before he'll kill her. And that's his way of owning her. So in a way, the artist signs her death warrant, because as soon as the picture is completed, the Duke can have her executed. And then similarly, the statue of Neptune at the end is beautiful, of course, but also symbolises male patriarchal power in the form of Neptune, controlling the seahorse, which represents the female, and in this relationship that represents the Duke's wife, or the new wife that's coming from the Count. So lots of really good comparisons there. I'm really happy with it. Or I can go to London, which writes about the problems in society which are being caused by those in power, or we can easily see that represented in Ozymandias. Although Blake is criticising the church and the king and parliament, we don't get that. We just get a dictator in Ozymandias. So it's not really as full a comparison. I'm only going to compare it if I have to. My Last Duchess is going to be my go-to poem. So we've just done a really good comparison between My Last Duchess and London. But let's delve a little deeper. So My Last Duchess is written to show the corrupt power of the patriarchy. You remember that's male power that makes women subservient and victims of male power. You can easily see that in the poem. He's also trying to write a new kind of poetry, as I've already discussed. He's also talking about the corruption of the nobility, as we've seen, and the compromise between artists and those in power. Well, if we go further into London, we can see that this is always also about the damaging effect of male sexual desire exercised without conscience. And you saw that in the description that I told you about the effect of prostitution and sexually transmitted diseases. And what's interesting in My Last Duchess is there's no reference to any kind of sexuality at all. And so there's an opposite going on here. His power is all about ownership and not about sexuality in any way. In fact, I'd even argue that he doesn't even like women. But anyway, you'd need to go into my video on My Last Duchess to understand that. They both show the damaging effects on society when it exploits its children. We saw that in the analysis of London earlier. You might have forgotten that when he marries much younger women. And these are both children of men who offer up their daughters because it's a patriarchal society. In the case of the Count, who this monologue is spoken for, in the case of the Count, he's expecting the Count to give up his daughter to marry the Duke, even though he's just confessed to killing his last wife. I mean, that's how corrupt the patriarchal society is. He's expecting a powerful man, the Duke, to sacrifice the happiness of his daughter just so that she can marry a more powerful man in the Duke. So that really is how a society damages here its female children. But interestingly, there's a left field choice here of Poppies, because Poppies also explores the power of the patriarchy and what this does to the mother's role as opposed to the father's that I've just discussed. It breeds naivety and overconfidence in men, as we see with her son going off to war, and that's a contrast to the Duke, who has complete overconfidence because he even confesses to a murder, but he's not naive. He knows he's going to get away with it because his patriarchal society is so corrupt. And they both explore the importance of memory. So this whole poem is about her memories, and that's what the art is for in My Last Duchess. It's all to preserve his memories of what he's owned. Now, pretty good comparisons, but you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to prioritise London because it's written pre-1918, and I'll be able to focus better on form and structure. Now, Emigree is a really interesting poem. It's easy when you see it on the page to kind of think, oh, it's not really very much good. But when you start to analyse the number of purposes the poet has, there's a lot in it. So number one, to explore the difficulties faced by migrants fleeing corrupt political systems in the countries they leave and in the countries they settle in. So there's two cities in the poem, one that she's left and one that she's living in now, and both appear potentially hostile, to show that cities are corrupt and dangerous, and to show how a lone voice can try to achieve political change. That's my interpretation of the last couplet of the poem. And to show how the past is reinterpreted and how memory is precious, even though in this case it changes the facts. That's quite unusual for the poems that we faced, but that does work here. To show how the oppressed can resist tyrannical power, and to show the importance of metaphor, because the whole poem is told through metaphor. Well, there are three poems I'm going to show you you can compare it with. Now, obviously, you know by now I'm going to recommend London Should Come Top, because it is a pre-1918 poem and has a really clear, defined structure and form, whereas Emigree doesn't. So London also shows that cities are inherently corrupt, here that private ownership excludes the ordinary man, and it makes everybody miserable. That's a really close parallel with the city she's left. The problems with society are caused by those in power, an exact parallel. Here it's the church, the king and parliament. There it's tyrants. We could argue that it's the patriarchy in both, because we've got a female voice here who's being oppressed, and the tyrants are presumably male. To show the damaging effects on society when it exploits its children. Well, that's why this poem is all about her childhood memories, and she has been exploited by having to leave her country and become a migrant. So lots of parallels there. Similarly, checking out my history to show how political power can be resisted by the oppressed. That links again to the final line of Emigree. To celebrate poetry as a form of protest and a way to acquire political power or gain social advantage. So that's the purpose of writing this poem, and we can consider whether this poem is also written in order to protest against the way we discriminate against foreigners who need to come here because of war. A very topical one, that. I wouldn't be surprised if this one in our days of Brexit didn't come up as the chosen poem. And to explore the immigrant experience and ask for greater acceptance. So really close parallels there. So I would be really happy to use Checking Out My History, because you can say a lot about its structure and form in the way that it interweaves a kind of childlike nursery rhyme to discredit the British voice and a more free verse to have an Afro-Caribbean voice. Now, amazingly, there are just as many parallels with Tissue. And I'm going to advise you, obviously, not to do Tissue because it doesn't have a strong form or structure. However, if this is the named poem in the exam, then why not use Emigree to compare it to? So to ask for tolerance and cultural and religious understanding, well, this is definitely to ask for tolerance and understanding. To ask for equality for all people, that would definitely resonate with the two cultures, one that she's left and one that she's moved to. To explore the importance of family and family history. And in this poem, it's noticeable that she is a child on her own. There's no reference to mother or father, and we get the sense that she's lost them. Either been orphaned before she came over, or her parents are still stuck in whatever the old city was, and they've only been able to smuggle her out. And the other thing is, this is a poem full of metaphor, just like that one. And so there is a stylistic and structural connection. So that would also be a really good comparison. And now we come to Poppies. This poem is written to explore the power of the patriarchy again. What this does to define a mother's role. So this mother has to hide her emotions from her son, put aside her misgivings, and respect his desire, presumably to go off to war, although I have 2 videos on Poppies, so you do not have to read this as a war poem at all. It could simply be about motherhood. Anyway, that's up to you. Watch the videos if you wish. How it breeds naivety and overconfidence in men. You know, it's really clear that the son is going off to a future that he thinks is going to be magnificent and which the mother fears is going to be tragic. And to explore the consequences of a warrior culture and a death cult. You know, that's what enlisting and going off to war as a noble and adventurous activity suggests. You can only have a warrior culture to make men happy joining it. And she explores the effect this has on women, in particular mothers, and to explore the importance of memory. You know, the whole poem is told through the mother's memories and in the past tense. Well, as you can see, there are loads of connections with Kamikaze, which is also to show a culture which has chosen to abandon the celebration of life and instead glorify death in the tradition of the kamikaze pilot. It shows the after effects of war on those who participate in it and those left behind, and here it's those left behind that we have the comparison to. To portray a cultural celebration of patriotism and the warrior and sacrifice, here also for the emperor, which is a slight difference to Poppies. To show that time can heal and generations form new perspectives. Arguably, I think the image of the mother in Poppies standing at the memorial to dead soldiers probably suggests that time doesn't heal. So an interesting difference there that would create a nice contrast for you. And this one also explores the importance of memory to our understanding. So loads of comparisons. However, it's not my top one because Kamikaze does not have any obvious structure and form, and neither does Poppies, and so it's going to be super difficult for you to get the top grades. So instead, I'd ask you to think about My Last Duchess. This again is about the patriarchy and how it's corrupt, but here women are the victims of it, and they're very definite victims. The men in power seem not to suffer. There's an interesting parallel here because if the son has died, he has suffered. And that's similar to the idea that the Duke has executed not just his ex-wife, the Duchess, but somebody else in that line. All smiles stopped together. Very strongly suggests a plural. It's written to criticise the compromise between artists and those in power. Well, this is the compromise between women and men's aspirations. So it's not about art, but it's very definitely about compromise. and it also explores the importance of memory. And at the end of the poem, we've got this feeling of impending tragedy at the end of this poem, where we think the son has probably died. And we've got another feeling of impending tragedy at the end of My Last Duchess, when the tragedy is that the Count will probably still marry his daughter to the Duke, even though he knows the Duke is a murderer. So this again is a society that celebrates the power of men and the culture of death. You know, as long as it's done on a male's terms, and that's very similar to the culture of death that the son lives in and celebrates in Poppies. And of course, we have the title itself, which is a memento mori, a reminder of death, and you could say a celebration of it. You know, we all wear it in our lapels every November, not just to commemorate the dead, but also to celebrate their sacrifice. And so we perpetuate the idea that it is a noble thing to die for your country. Now we have the Prelude. This is a difficult one to engage with because it just seems so odd and the story in it is so weird. I recommend that you watch my video on the Prelude. In fact, I think I've got a couple, in fact maybe 3, because it's a difficult one to get to. But as you can see, there are loads of purposes, so an easy poem to get the grade 7 and above in. So one idea is to explore the power and deity in nature. And the idea that God can be found in nature is given a name. It's called pantheism. And there you are, automatically. Examiner wants to give you a grade 7 because you're using the right vocabulary. I'm kicking myself for not having put it in there originally. It's also to celebrate the power of the imagination, the artistic imagination. And it's to show that mankind is small compared to the power of nature. This little figure of him in the boat as a young boy, suddenly feeling terrified of nature and what it might signify. It's a poem written to analyse the feelings and desires of a young man by dealing with them symbolically. So everything in this poem acts as a symbol of something else. To explore his feelings about sexuality and perhaps incest. This interpretation might shock you. You can ignore it if you're not interested in it, or go to my other videos if you're interested. To celebrate the power of poetry and to explore the importance of memory. So the key thing about the Prelude is it wasn't written by Wordsworth in order to be published. He kept it private for decades, worked on it, and after his death it was published posthumously. So there are lots of deep and private memories and private symbols in here, and lots of reasons why he didn't make it public, okay? So we've got a choice of 2 here. Well, I'm going to kind of ignore London because it's only got one comparison. So we're stuck with Storm on the Island. Storm on the Island is to celebrate the art of the poet in using extended metaphor. The whole poem is about this. So all of nature is an extended metaphor which also describes war and conflict. And this kind of poetic language and poetic skill is what Wordsworth intends to show off in the Prelude as well. And then there's this central message to show that mankind is small compared to the power of nature. We could also argue that there is no God in this poem. Do you remember that line, "It's a great nothing that we fear"? Perhaps this is an atheistic poem, which would then contrast with the belief not in a God in heaven, but with pantheism, a God in nature, a God everywhere. So this is a really tricky one to find a comparison to, and Storm on the Island is going to be your go-to comparison if this one comes up. And because the Prelude is about finding personal freedom and following your desires and feelings, it deliberately gets rid of form. It isn't tied down with rhyme and meter and a strict syllable structure. And that lack of form is precisely the point. It links to Wordsworth's purpose about finding greater freedom, liberated from the church, celebrating pantheism, a God surrounding us everywhere in his natural works. Next, we have Checking Out My History. This is, as you've seen, a really cracking poem to use because it does have a really defined form and structure and will enable you to get the top grades. The purpose? Well, to show the corrupt power of British and French imperialism, to celebrate education and bring to light forgotten history. The whole point of this poem is about the history that we should be taught, and it's passionate about giving people the right education in order to change lives. It's to show how political power can be resisted by the oppressed. That's the voice of the speaker, calling on other people like him from the same Afro-Caribbean heritage to rise up against the oppression of the one-sided Eurocentric history they've been taught and learn the true facts of their origins and the history of black people and African people in the past. To celebrate poetry as a form of protest and a way to acquire political power or gain social change, because it's also written for the white audience, if you like, in Britain, to get us to change our views about the immigrant population that we have welcomed into our country, but not fully welcomed through our education system. And then finally to explore the immigrant experience and ask for greater acceptance. Well, there are lots of poems that compares to. Remains gives us a very small one, so I'm going to ignore it. London, interestingly, gives us a lot. So this is a poem about the problems of society, and those problems are also caused by those in power. In this case, the church, the king and parliament. Well, we could argue that's very close to the people who wield power in the wider sense with education. And also, historically, it would have been the church and the king that wielded power when Britain was an imperialist country. To show the damaging effects on society when it exploits its children. And that's a direct link here through education. It's when people are children that they are given the wrong history, and it's when their identity is set. Now, obviously, I love this one as a comparison because it's short, and as you know, it is written pre-1918, so you can always talk about the structure and form. So that's my go-to comparison. However, Emigree also works super well because it explores the difficulties faced by migrants in a different culture. They're fleeing a corrupt political system, and these were rebelling against political systems, many of the people in Checking Out My History. And we've got this idea of leaving one country and settling in another, which of course is the narrative of the poet. That's exactly what he's done. And again, to show how a lone voice can try to achieve political change. That links directly to checking out me history. It's me, I'm checking out my identity, as he says at the end. And then more things from Emigree to show how the past is reinterpreted and how memory is precious. That's exactly what this is about. It's reinterpreting the past and showing it to us in a different light. Although it doesn't change the facts to falsehoods, but it does change the facts in Checking Out My History because it gives us new facts, ones that we didn't know, which somehow now become more important. And again, it shows how the oppressed can resist tyrannical power, just as she does at the end of her poem and he does at the end of his. So this is a really, really strong comparison. Now, because I can already talk about the structure and form of this poem, I can afford to compare it to Emigree if I want to. Yeah, I definitely need that with one poem. I'm still personally going to play safe because London has a much more visible form and structure I can write about. But as you can see, there are so many points we could make comparing it to Emigree that, to be honest, you'd probably write just as brilliant an essay comparing it that way. Next, we have War Photographer. This was always a favourite in the old exam before we got the new version in 2017. I've always got a sneaking feeling that this one's going to come back up again. And this is written to explore the damaging effect of war on those who report on it, to accuse the readership of indifference to foreign suffering. And that's not just in the newspapers that the War Photographer prints his photographs in, it's also the readership of the poem. Carol Ann Duffy's audience, and to suggest that war is inevitable and a common feature of humanity. And it's inevitable because we don't react against it. We are indifferent to stopping it. And it also questions the role of the media in perpetuating or preventing war. Well, the good news is there's only one poem that really matches all of those, and that's Charge of the Light Brigade. Obviously, I'm thrilled because it's a pre-1918 poem with the form and structure. So his purpose is to support patriotic propaganda. So it's the direct opposite of war photographer. It's to promote the cult of the warrior. Again, the direct opposite of the descriptions of death in war photographer. And death is a noble sacrifice in the Light Brigade, a complete opposite to the pointless tragic deaths that don't change our views at all. We just go back to our pre-lunch beers. This one also hints at the war being wrong. Again, you have to watch my video to work out how that's done. Most teachers don't teach that interpretation, I don't think. And this one strongly suggests that war is not wrong. And this one also explores the sound of poetry. Again, that's really well explained in my video on this poem. There isn't that much focus on sound in the purpose here. However, you can argue that it is if you know anything about Radio 4 and the shipping forecast, and you've got that link to the Beirut, Phnom Penh, Belfast. I've got the order wrong, but that kind of listing of places is exactly what you get in the shipping forecast. It's a middle-class rhythm that middle-class readers will be familiar with from Radio 4. And so this is a way that sound influences the understanding of the poem, because she's challenging the middle classes and saying, you know, you think that you're educated, you think that you've got a proper place in the world, but actually, what sort of world are you tolerating? You know, what's the price of your education if it allows these wars to continue without your protest? And whereas in this poem, we've got the opposite, you know, that where protest is forbidden. Nobody is blamed for the blunder. It's just someone had blundered. And no one is going to be made responsible for the senseless order that led to the death of over 400 men. So next we have Storm on the Island, and obviously I've already tried to persuade you that that's a really great comparison with the Prelude, but we'll have some other comparisons. So it's to question the assumption that conflict is natural, because it has become a way of life through historical accident. So the people on this island just seem to accept conflict, and that's what he's protesting about. To suggest that the causes of conflict are baseless and that the two sides should find peace. And that's apparent in the choice of title. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go and watch my video on this. And the idea of them fearing nothing suggests that the conflict is baseless. It has no point to it. It celebrates the art of the poet in using an extended metaphor. So all the weather in this poem is linked entirely to the language of war and violence. It's a kind of motif, a metaphor that runs throughout the poem. And also it shows that mankind is small compared to the power of nature. Well, let's have a look at how that compares with Kamikaze. To show that a culture can abandon life and glorify death. So there's a slight difference here. This one celebrates death. This one just thinks its conflict is normal and therefore death is normal. To show that time can heal and generations form new perspectives. Here, the poet is asking for people to heal by preventing the conflict. So a different sort of perspective. To show that war creates nihilism, this belief that life is pointless, and again that ending of this poem also suggests that life has become meaningless and pointless to the people living on the island. We can compare it to Bayonet Charge, where the purpose is to question the typical justifications of war, for example, patriotism and honour, and those are implied through the title and the struggles in Northern Ireland. To portray the war as a crime against nature, and we see that here with nature rebelling against the human population, as though nature itself is protesting against the conflict in Ireland. and to hint at the after effects of war on those who survive it, which you can see in the kind of lifestyle that's being described on the island. So if you're using the timestamp and you've missed what I've said about the Prelude, go back to the description, get the timestamp for the Prelude, and you'll see the comparison to Storm on the Island. That's probably your best bet. Right, I'm pretty excited about Bayonet Charge because there's pretty much only one comparison that I'm going to give you, so these come as a pair. Bayonet Charge is written to question, as we remember, the typical justifications for war, for example, patriotism and honour. It also wants to portray war as a crime against nature, to hint at the after effects of war on those who survive it, and to portray war as alien and dehumanising. You get that in this description of the soldier who suddenly wakes up, as in a nightmare and in an alien world, which we also pick up in the description of the yellow hair. And anyway, that's to protest against the effect of war. Now, exposure has loads of similarities. Exposure is also to explore the idea of patriotism and suggest that it is an illusion. These men are freezing to death for no reason. It focuses on the hardships of war, which are dehumanising, there's a nice link already, and make us sympathise with the soldiers. And I didn't include that, but obviously Bayonet Charge also asked us to sympathise with the soldier. To show that the British and the public are unprepared for the reality of war, and that soldiers are dying needlessly. And we see that in the description of the bullets rushing past this soldier. We can't believe that he actually survives. And we also see in the descriptions of him that he too is unprepared for the reality of war. Exposure, as you know, explores the use of sound in poetry, and I wouldn't say that was the purpose of Bayonet Charge, but you will also see it, especially in that phrase, the bullets smacking the belly out of the air. So we've got quite a lot of alliteration and sibilance that does a fine job of recreating sounds. So you'll be able to write about the kind of soundscape of the poem. And this shows how war creates a nihilism, which you remember is a despair that says life is pointless, and that has an echo in all those symbols of civilization like king, country, honour, etc. that the soldier sheds. So really easy comparisons to make, and again, you've got lots of interesting structure and form in this poem, so you don't have to worry too much that it's absent from Bayonet Charge. And then to Tissue, the poem that students and teachers across the country pray will never come up. So this is your insurance policy in case it does. It actually has a lot of purposes to show how patriotism and nationalism are damaging to human culture. We get that through these borders that are on the tissue paper of the map, and also the different colour skins of different cultures. It asks for tolerance and cultural and religious understanding. It asks for equality for all people. That's the point of the ending, and the change in skin colour at the end, being able to see through the skin so that we're all equal. To explore the importance of family and family history. And that's why we have these details of the family history written at the back of the Bible. It's not the Bible itself and the stories of the Bible. Here, of course, sorry, it's not the Bible, it's the Quran. But in a Christian household, it would have been the Bible. That's the parallel she's making. It's not the religious text that's important. It's the family history written at the back. Again, showing how we're all equal and we're all from similar descendants. The prophets of the Quran are the same as the prophets in the Bible. You know, they all start from the same prophets. Anyway, you need to go to my videos on tissue if any of this is new to you. And again, it shows the importance of metaphor because the whole poem is told through metaphor. Well, you can clearly see a lot of similarities with Emigree, where it's also about different cultures and crossing borders. That's what migrants do. And the differences between countries, again, that was apparent in Tissue. It's to show how a lone voice can try to achieve political change. And that's just what Imtiaz Darka is trying to do with her poem. It's a poem of protest, but a poem also gently asking for political change. It's to show how the past can be reinterpreted, looked at in a different way. And I'd argue that all the images in this poem are all a recreation of the past, trying to look at the past in a different way so that we can build a better future. Again, it is to show the importance of metaphor and the importance of memory. So lots of comparisons you can make there. The problem that we've got is there isn't a strong structure to Emigree, and there isn't a strong structure and form to Tissue. So although they compare really well, this is a comparison that's going to be difficult to get into grades 8 and 9, even into grade 7. However, as you know, checking out my history has lots of structural features. If you haven't watched that part of the video, use the timestamp in the description to go back to the checking out my history section. So this is to show the corrupt power of British and French imperialism, which links to the idea of patriotism and national borders and how one culture tries to oppress and dominate another. It celebrates education and it wants to bring to light forgotten history, and I'd argue that the memories in this also try to bring to light forgotten history and also educate us. She's trying to educate both sides who might fear each other because they come from different cultures to say that actually we're a lot more similar than we think. And to show how political power can be resisted by the oppressed. There isn't an obvious comparison there, so we'd say that was a difference. Let's have a look at the last two. To celebrate poetry as a form of protest, well, that certainly happens here. Tissue, of course, can be a metaphor for the paper that the poet writes the poem on. So it's directly a celebration of poetry, and this poem is asking for personal change, which would lead to political change, because we would, as a culture, stop seeing other cultures as threatening, and likewise they would stop seeing us as threatening if they followed the teaching of the poem. And it also explores the immigrant's experience and asks for greater acceptance. So Imtiaz Darker, as you probably know, is part Scottish and part Indian. She lives in Scotland and in India, and therefore explores both parts of her heritage and culture, but is in some ways an outsider in both. And so there's always this desire for greater acceptance wherever she might be. So I'm going to take the notes that I've made from this video and post them to my community. I don't know if you're using these community posts, but the idea is that I give you a Dropbox link, and then you've got these notes to revise from. I hope that will be a real step forward in your revision and something that I don't think other YouTubers are doing yet. And as usual, good luck with your exam. See you soon on my channel.